Hello, everybody. I would like to warmly welcome you to the final conference, Solidarities in Conflict and War Zones, organized by the research project KnowWar. KnowWar is a short form for knowledge production in times of flight and war, developing common grounds for research on Syria. It's really absolutely great that you're joining our conference, and for sure, if you like to actively participate by using the chat for your questions and comments. More on that in a few minutes. My name is Helmut Krieger. I'm a researcher and senior lecturer at the Department of Development Studies here at the University of Vienna, and serve as the overall project coordinator of KnowWar as well. First of all, I would like to thank all colleagues working in the project for their wonderful engagement and for the way how they deal with permanent challenges, let's call it in this way, and for sure permanent obstacles we had to face during the last 3.5 years. It was and still is a pleasure, and for sure at the same time a huge challenge to collaborate on very, very different levels while being confronted with the ongoing war in Syria, the multiple, as it is often called, the multiple crises in Lebanon, the colonial occupation in Palestine, Israel's war on Gaza in 2021, and for sure the pandemic and its repercussions on our individual lives and our collective work as well. So thank you really so much, and I'm very, very sorry not to name you all now due to the very strict timeline we have for the conference. For sure, you all will be introduced when speaking at different panels. So I would like to name just a few colleagues. My special thanks go to Claudia Wieser, who has contributed extensively to the success of the project over the last 3.5 years, both administratively and scientifically. Without her commitment, also this conference would have not been possible. So thank you really so much, Claudia, for all your efforts and all your commitment. For sure, I also would like to thank Rabia Nasser for his daily support, critical reflection of our project, as well as his innovative ideas to push forward KnowWar as well. And it is at the same time a great experience to share a common office here in Vienna as well. So thank you really so much for everything, Rabia. And I would also like to thank Kazem Sabah and Rawia Musa from Musawat, who invited colleagues and friends to join the conference together on site in Beirut. This, I think, is really a wonderful way and idea to overcome the distance created by online conferences. So thank you really so much for that, and my warmest greetings to all of you in Beirut. As you know, originally we planned to have this conference in Beirut on site, but unfortunately due to the pandemic, we have now decided to hold the conference online. Furthermore, and for sure, I would like to thank our interpreters, Rana Daou and Elsa Risk, for the wonderful job they will do. They are already doing today and tomorrow. And George Laya and Hani Jan from Shark, our technical service provider, for their modern professional way to deal with all challenges on a technical level. Last but not least, as our project is funded by the Austrian Development Agency, I would like to thank the ADA for its financial support. Just a few technical remarks. If you have any kind of technical problem, please contact Al-Sharq immediately. I think Al-Sharq will post its contact address in the chat, and definitely they will find a solution to all kinds of technical problems that may arise. Secondly, you can find the button translation on the bottom of your screen. Please select the language in which you want to listen to the conference. So you have, as you know, this is a conference organized bilingually. That means in English as well as in Arabic. You have the option to choose the language you want to listen to. And for all speakers, yes, please select the language in which you will talk. And thirdly, please feel free to post your questions and comments in the chat in English or Arabic at any time. So the comments will be collected and sent to the moderators, just to let you know. This includes that the chat is permanently open during the whole conference, so you can send your questions and comments whenever you like to. And it's absolutely great to receive your messages in the chat. Really, thank you so much for that. I'm just looking at the chat. Some remarks on the main topics, the main research questions of KnowWar, mirrored for sure also in the conference program. KnowWar in general consists of 5 partners: the Syrian Center for Policy Research, SCPR, Musawat, an NGO based in the Palestinian refugee camp in Marilias in Beirut, the Center for Development Studies at Birzeit University in Palestine, the CDS, our department, that means the Department of Development Studies here at the University of Vienna, and our colleagues from the Center for Peace Research and Peace Education at the Alps Adriatic University in Klagenfurt in the south of Austria. Really, thanks a lot for the slide. Here you can see the different project partners as well. So just a few remarks on the content and the main topics we decided to work on. Initiated by social movements, the revolts in the Arab world over the last decades have for sure reinforced the relevance of inclusive political systems based on fundamental socioeconomic rights and based on the dignity of the marginalized. Given the massive material as well as immaterial destruction, the unprecedented levels of war crimes and forced displacements societies in some Arab countries are confronted with, it comes for sure as no surprise that the initial hopes of creating just and sustained processes to overcome authoritarianism, poverty, and imperial interventions have diminished. Furthermore, as we can see every day, Israeli dominance on the Palestinian society in its different localities appears to be as strong as ever. However, at the same time, we could observe in the last years or so some more cycles of mobilization and protests. And that means they continue, albeit under fundamentally changed conditions. At the same time, and that was a starting point for us as a research project, the analytical confusion about conflict dynamics has made it clear that protests and uprisings and I use now a very general term, in conflict zones under overall imperial conditions cannot be adequately analyzed by adopting mainstream research strategies, tools, and epistemologies. So researching back in that sense by innovatively creating transformative epistemologies, methodologies, has thus become one of the starting points and fundamental challenge for our project, for KnowWar. Based on reconfiguring solidarities in conflict and war zones, our research project rests on the following pillars: to research on solidarities in and between marginalized communities, Palestinian, Syrian, Lebanese, Palestinian, Syrian communities in Lebanon. Secondly, to work out a concept of solidarity economy under conditions of armed conflict in Syria and colonial occupation in Palestine. And thirdly, and that is more or less the overall frame of it, to conceptualize epistemologies for transformative research strategies. So the structure of our conference covers exactly these three pillars accordingly. Vijay Prashad, and it's absolutely great that you can join and will hold our keynote lecture. Vijay will give a keynote lecture on the very general term of emerging solidarities in times of crises and war in a few minutes. And after that, we will discuss the necessity to transform research epistemologies in war zones. And today's last panel, the third one, will then cover the challenge of researching solidarities in Lebanon, as I mentioned before. Tomorrow, we will start with the question how solidarities can be explored in the Syrian conflict. So this will be followed then by the overall issue of solidarity economy in opposition to what is called conflict economy. At this panel, we will discuss the experiences in Palestine and a concept of solidarity economy adapted and worked out for communities in Syria. And after that, tomorrow's last panel is designed as a concluding discussion on the project partners titled Researching Back Contradictions and Perspectives, where we will explore future possible pathways for the future as well. So this is the overall frame of our conference. For sure, it is a kind of presenting and definitely discussing our initial research results with all of you. And that's absolutely great that you will actively participate in this conference as well. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I have to conclude with a statement about one of the most prominent Palestinian journalists, Shirin Abu Akleh, who was killed today in the morning by the occupation forces in Jenin. The occupation forces shot Shirin in the head while she was on her work in the northern part of the West Bank. We strongly condemn, we condemn in the strongest terms possible this killing by the occupation forces. We know for sure at the same time that unfortunately Shirin is not the first journalist killed by the occupation forces, and definitely we knew that without an end of a colonial occupation by the Israeli state, there will never be any kind of a space for a just peace. So that is an opening remark from my side, and I would like to hand over now to Petra Dannecker. She will chair the keynote lecture by Vijay Prashad, and really thanks again so much for holding this keynote lecture. Petra is a professor of development sociology, and since 2011, yes, the head of the Department of Development Studies here at the University of Vienna. Furthermore, she serves as a research reviewer in our project as well. So thank you so much for joining our conference, and over to you, Petra.
Yeah, thank you very much, Helmut, and thank you for this introduction. And I have to say, it's a pleasure to be part of the conference, and it's an honor actually to moderate today's keynote lecture by Vijay Prashad. I believe that most of you know him. I don't think I do have to say a lot. I and probably most of you appreciate receiving regularly mails from him in the form of the newsletter from the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, of which he is the executive director since 2010. Vijay was born in Kolkata, studied in the US, and did his PhD at the University of Chicago, and is definitely, I would say, one of the most prominent leftist intellectuals we have currently, and criticizing primarily contemporary capitalism in all its different forms and with all the different impact it has worldwide. He's also the chief editor of the Left World Books, besides being the director of the Transcontinental Institute, and he was also chair of the Edward Said chair at the University of Beirut from 2013 to 2014. And I have to say, I don't know how you do that. Maybe that's a secret, but you have written more than 20 books. And I think everybody who writes articles and books knows what this actually implies, and that it's really difficult to imagine since you are also regularly publishing articles in various journals and newspapers, and of course in the Globetrotter, where you are a chief correspondent. And for me, and also following up what you have written over the years, I think you represent as a person what your institute actually stands for, bridging the academic production with the political and social movements. And I think we all know how difficult this is, and what kind of negotiations this also implies, and also to promote critical thinking and stimulate debates and research. And I'm quite sure that also your keynote with the title Emerging Solidarities in Times of Global Crisis and War will provide an interesting debate and maybe also some new aspects for further research. I think the topic already reveals that we desperately need to discuss this further, faced with the actual situation we face everywhere in the world. So I gave over to you. I'm very much looking forward to your lecture. It's a pleasure to have you around today. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks a lot, Petra. I really appreciate your kind words. And Helmut and everybody who made this possible. I first heard about KnowWar through my dear friend Omar Dahi. So it's a great pleasure to be here, and I wish we could have been together in Beirut, sitting, looking out at the Mediterranean, talking about these things. It's a difficult day today because all Palestine grieves for the loss of its voice. Shireen, at the age of 51, had become the voice of Palestine. People grew up watching her on television, on Al Jazeera, reporting about the atrocity of the Israeli apartheid state. She died as she lived, which is reporting something hideous. And there she was wearing a blue press body armor. Right on her chest, it said press. And she was shot in the face. Hideous situation in our world. Our world is so upsetting now. It's difficult to spend a day without being upset by things. I have more and more friends who have decided, even friends who live in very difficult places, they've decided, I don't want to follow the news anymore. I just want to turn inward. The pandemic has created a kind of social condition of inwardness. The lockdown has given people a new experience of family life, perhaps. And there is this inward turn, this repulsion from the world. Like W.H. Auden wrote, the map is filled with names of places that have become ugly. Whether it's Ukraine or it's earlier Syria, now Syria, Yemen, the Congo, and so on. It's hard to remember the days of Tahrir. It's very hard to remember that. It's difficult to remember walking through that square. For me personally, walking through that square was followed just a few months later by being in Tripoli in Libya and experiencing something quite the opposite of Tahrir Square. And that was not something that waited 10 years. We forget that the NATO attack on Libya took place months into the uprising in Tunisia, and in Egypt. Months later, there was that attack on Libya, which really destroyed North Africa. And I'm going to return to that. Democracy was a cry that was heard a decade ago in the Arab lands. Certainly, it was a cry. It was a cry that is still legible in many parts of the world. I don't think we should, even in our writings, suppress the cry of democracy that's legible. And the word democracy means so many things to so many different people. It's certainly not an analog of US liberal political science, the kind of elections that the United States has, the political polarization. For God's sake, in 2022, they're going to make abortion illegal. What lessons does one have to take from the United States about democracy? For God's sake, let us have a richer understanding. And often the cry that comes from below is much richer than what one reads in the kind of dull textbooks of political science. That cry is there, but it's not always understood, I think. And I'm going to again return to that a little bit. Look, I'm going to use a phrase that may be uncomfortable for us because it sounds more political and academic. The phrase is the imperialist powers. I don't really know how to talk about this other than to use terms like that. The term imperialism has vanished from sophisticated academic writing. It elicits a lot of eye rolling and a lot of, breathing on the side. Oh my God. Oh God, imperialism. What is he talking about? Sounds anachronistic. For God's sake, let's be serious. Let's talk about, the democratic nations or the G7, or let's talk about NATO countries, the European Union. We can't talk about imperialism. There's something anachronistic, ugly even, about using that term, particularly in an academic forum. It's certainly ugly to use it in an academic forum. It's like talking about racism, really talking about racism, or the word apartheid in reference to Israel. It makes some people uncomfortable. Well, imperialism. The imperialist powers had their own agenda and continued to have their own agenda regarding that cry of democracy. You'd have to have been on Mars not to have seen how the imperialist agenda during that period of the cry of democracy in the Arab lands 10 years ago, you'd have to be from Mars not to see that they quickly wrapped that cry into the so-called global war on terror, which was part of the strategic doctrine of the United States from 2001 to 2018. All aspects of the uprisings were wrapped into the concept global war on terror. Look, let's remember that when the protests began in Egypt, not just in Tahrir Square in Cairo, but in Port Said, in Alexandria, in Mahalla, where the textile workers rose up. We forget that textile workers of Mahalla took the bus and train to Cairo to march into that square. It wasn't just the Muslim Brotherhood. Working class organizations were participating. What did the United States do? Remember this? Now buried under the rubble of Morsi's overthrow, and now Sisi's return, or the military's return to power, buried under the rubble of that is the fact that the United States sent Frank Wisner Jr. as the envoy from Hillary Clinton. Frank Wisner Jr.'s father was one of the founders of the Central Intelligence Agency. Frank arrived in Cairo, went to see Mubarak and told him, listen, you need to make a few concessions, but we're with you all the way. We're with you all the way. You forget maybe that when Ben Ali was facing protests in Tunisia, his great friend Sarkozy sent 2 high cabinet members to visit him in Tunis and say, is there a way to make concessions? Is there a way to keep you in power? We forget all that. Obama, making the great speech at Cairo University about democracy. What democracy? Not for the kind of democracy people wanted. Not that. Anything but that. Anything but that. They wrapped the uprisings into the discourse of the war on terror, which is why it became so absolutely difficult to talk about Syria. Absolutely difficult to talk about Syria. It became difficult to talk about Syria in empirical terms. It became difficult to lift up knowledge about Syria, the complexities. It became difficult to talk about the fact that different parts of Syria were experiencing different things. Of course, there were some nasty political forces rising up, but there were other things happening as well. It was a very complicated landscape, as most political uprisings are. But none of that was possible because, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, Syria was also wrapped into another story. It had ceased to be about Syria itself. People would say at that time, let's hear from the Syrians. We haven't got Syrian voices and so on. Of course, that's true. But in fact, that was never going to be allowed to be a conflict about Syria. It was another conflict. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Much the same actually with Libya. A country that didn't need to be destroyed like that. I have friends on both sides of that struggle. People who had been within the Gaddafi project and, lawyers in Benghazi who were beneficiaries of the oil economy. It's a funny thing that Gaddafi decided they were going to decentralize institutions in Libya, not have all the universities in Tripoli. So the law school was put in Benghazi. And so a lot of the most interesting lawyers lived in Benghazi. And, they also joined in this uprising. I had friends among them, many of them who were killed, not by the forces of Gaddafi, but by their own allies. The forces that had returned from Turkey and Syria, who had been fighting there on behalf of what used to be the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, and then morphed into 100 different platforms. Libya was destroyed. Was there any need for that? I mean, these are questions I'm putting on the table. I want us to recover these questions. You know, after the war, Peter Olsen or rather after the NATO bombing, because the war didn't end, after the NATO bombing, Peter Olsen of NATO, the lead lawyer for NATO, when asked, would NATO accept an investigation of its bombing runs in Libya? Because as Donatella Rivera of Amnesty had found, there were lots of discrepancies, lots of civilian deaths and so on. Peter Olsen said something pretty clear. He said, NATO never commits war crimes. Therefore, we will never submit to investigation. Only the savage commits war crimes. It's only Gaddafi or Bashar al-Assad who will commit war crimes. The West never does. You know, that's the nature of imperialism, is that it is able to convert itself when convenient into the savior. And I must say, during that time, and I'm reflecting backwards, during that time, too many people of sensitive nature believed what the West was saying, believed that Western intervention somehow was going to be liberatory, and continued to hold those views, you know, even when it comes to, say, Ukraine. Believe that the West is there to bring democracy and human rights and so on. This is a very dangerous belief, and I want to put that belief on the table. Well, it became clear to me that the conflict in Syria, which was escalating in 2013, 14, 15, the conflict in Syria at that time had ceased to be, in fact, merely about the Syrian people. It had ceased also to be about Turkey and Saudi Arabia and regional powers who had their own games that they were playing. I mean, it was very clear that Turkey was playing its games with its own Muslim Brotherhood platforms and so on. They had their own agenda. That was very clear. They wanted to also, quote unquote, recover territory in northern Syria, which they have claimed for decades, if not longer. In Turkey, sometimes the claims are much longer than decades. But the war in Syria had ceased to be all that, about the Syrian people, about even regional ambitions, Iran, Saudi Arabia, you know, and so on. It had ceased to be all that. It became something else. It became, in fact, linked to Ukraine. And at the time, it was not clear to all of us who were reporting on the story that the story had pivoted away from the Middle East and linked Ukraine to Syria already. What was the linkage? 2010 to 2014, there was a major battle in Ukraine over whether Ukraine should be integrated into a Eurasian project or it should integrate into Europe. Major battle from 2010, the election of 2010. In 2014, look, people may disagree with what I'm going to say now, but in 2014, the United States directly intervened in Ukraine to put an interim government in place and then Petro Poroshenko. And, you know, you can go and listen to the leaked phone call from Victoria Nuland in the Maidan, you know, where she talks about how the United States cannot allow a pro-Russian, what they call pro-Russian, but in fact was somebody who might have wanted to integrate not only into Russia, but also China. You remember that this is just after China has announced the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. Later, 17 European countries joined the Belt and Road and so on. We don't have time to get into all that. But anyway, Russia immediately intervened to seize Crimea. It was interesting. Later, there's a referendum and the Crimeans vote overwhelmingly to join Russia. But that was not about Russian-speaking people of Crimea. It was about the Russian naval base in Sevastopol. That was the principal reason for the intervention. And just months later, in September 2015, Russian military planes enter Syria. And we never made the connection, actually, between these two interventions. But they were both about Russia's sense that it was going to lose its two main warm water ports, one in Sevastopol, Crimea, and the second in Latakia, in Tartus, in Syria. I later interviewed people in the Russian security world, and they talked about that anxiety about those two losses as being the principal issue. In fact, it's interesting because if you look at it, these are the two main warm water ports that Russia has anywhere. They don't have any others. Well, now the Arctic is beginning to see the ice not settle right through the year. So they may have more warm water ports eventually because of the catastrophe of climate change. But it's not there now. Now there are two principal naval ports outside the time of the summer are in Sevastopol in the Black Sea and in Tartus, in Latakia. Those two interventions were very much related. In that sense, Syria was already dragged into another conflict. What is the nature of that conflict, which Syria and Ukraine have been dragged into? In 2018, the US government, in its national security defense strategy, made this very clear. The US government in 2018 said that no longer is the United States going to prosecute the war on terror. I don't know if you followed this, but in fact, during the Trump administration, the global war on terror, which had been renamed by Obama, contingency of military operations or whatever, the global war on terror was declared finished in 2018. And the United States strategy pivoted to an entirely different project. This different project was to ensure, and this is a direct quote from US Secretary of Defense James Mattis, it was to ensure that near-peer rivals, this was Mattis's phrase, near-peer rivals would not be permitted to advance. And the United States named these two near-peer rivals as Russia and China. A few weeks ago, US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said that the project in Ukraine, why the United States is going to give $33 billion of weapons to Ukraine, is not to remove Russian troops from Ukraine. That was not the point. The point, said US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, is to weaken Russia. That's his phrase, weaken Russia. Liz Truss, the UK's foreign secretary, said that if China doesn't break ties with Russia, then the West is going to weaken China. This phrase weaken, this use of the word weaken, is very key here. It reflects back to the security doctrine from 2018 of the US government, where they also talk about weakening near-peer rivals. That's the broad context of where these conflicts in Ukraine, in Syria, they ceased to be local or regional conflicts. They became part of a terrible, terrible conflict that we're in the middle of, which is prosecuted largely, and again, this might be controversial, but I would say prosecuted largely by the United States to prevent the so-called rise of China and to prevent Europe's quote-unquote dependence on Russian energy. Donald Trump said to Jens Stoltenberg, why should we, and he means NATO. See, the United States is very clear that NATO is a Trojan horse of US power. It's not really a joint project with the Europeans. What Donald Trump told Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, was that we, meaning NATO, that's how he was speaking, we don't want to guarantee your defense, by which he meant Europe, if you continue to buy energy from Russia. Why should we defend you from Russia if you're buying energy from them? That's what's on the table, friends. This is not a game of democracy and so on. This is the hard ugliness of power. I'm going to tell you two quick stories and then I'm going to try to wrap it up, Petra. Just two quick stories. In the last 2.5 years, I've been doing some reporting from Mozambique and from Mali, also Niger. I want to share these stories quickly. As a consequence of the war in Libya, the entire Sahel region from Mauritania to Niger has been destabilized. In fact, 3 of the countries in the Sahel have had military dictatorships. Mali had 2 military coups in 2020, 2021. Burkina Faso, military coup, Guinea, military coup. Mali has faced a long-term problem of particularly insurgencies of the Tuareg people in the north of Mali. And even that's complicated because there are Tuareg noble people who are fighting their own battle. There are some hierarchical issues there. And then there are battles between Dogon pastoralists, agriculturalists, and the Fulani herders in the central part of Mali. And finally, there's just the battle against IMF-driven austerity. In 2009, I'd interviewed Alpha Omar Konare, who was then the president of Mali. And he said, look, if we could get a debt relief package from the IMF and the West, I can actually drive an agenda in the country that addresses some of the grievances of people, particularly in central Mali, the Fulani and the Dogon people, around water sources and so on. He said, we can't get a break from them. We can't get a break from them. In 2013, the French intervened as part of the global war on terror. This year, the Malian military junta has ejected the French, who have then moved to Niger and continue to overfly Mali, which is why just this week, the Malian government said any French troops in or over Mali, it's illegal. Meanwhile, the UN Secretary General goes to Niger just again this week, and he talks about the conflict of Mali in the language of terrorism. Again, suborning these conflicts to the language of terrorism. When will we talk about the IMF debt crisis? When will we talk about, the old animosities, inherited animosities that we need to overcome through dialogue, consultation, and so on? There's plenty of evidence in Mali itself of local groups that are trying desperately to overcome in their localities, to overcome conflict. I mean, the Al-Qaeda people that I remember meeting, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, many of these people are basically cigarette smugglers. They smuggle cigarettes across the Sahara and they smuggle weapons as well, but mainly cigarettes. It's a huge economy between Algeria and so on. Increasingly, these forces have become major participants in the cocaine trade. I don't have a lot of time to get into this, but cocaine has been moving increasingly from Latin America into the Sahel, up the Sahara into Europe. And then sometimes from Rotterdam, it goes to New Bedford in Massachusetts to enter the United States. There's a lot of money in the cocaine trade in Mali. In fact, there's a suburb of Bamako, which is known as Cocaineville, where a lot of the big dealers have their homes. None of this is part of the conversation because they continue to use the war on terror as the language to basically suffocate or prevent us from having a discussion about the debt crisis, about, to some extent, the climate catastrophe, the desiccation of the Sahel region, and so on. None of this is allowed to be talked about. Everything has to be about terrorism. And these young men particularly go off and join Al-Qaeda, smuggling cigarettes and whatever. The only thing for them, rather than a jobs program and so on, is death. This is a politics of death. There is no politics of dealing with the dilemmas of humanity. Quickly coming to Mozambique. In northern Mozambique, just off the coast, ExxonMobil and Total, the French company, they found a major natural gas field, second largest off the coast of Africa. a number of people in Cabo Delgado, which is the poorest province in Mozambique, itself a poor country, number of people began to ask questions, why can't we get some of the benefits from this natural gas field? Many of them, ex-Mozambican military and police, of course, started in insurgency. And of course, they call themselves Al-Shabaab. Now, Al-Shabaab, as you all know, is the youth, which is what they are. They are young people. But of course, it's convenient to the French government and the US government that they used an Arabic word. And they started to say, well, this is terrorism. Again, the language of terrorism. Although the global war on terror was meant to have ended in 2018, language of terrorism suborned here, brought here. The government of Mozambique couldn't deal with the insurgency because it's actually got enormous popular support. And the fighters kept going across the border to Tanzania and so on. It was hard to get them. So they made a deal with the French government. The French government made a deal with Rwanda, where France told Rwanda that we will apologize for the genocide of 1994, but you have to send troops into Cabo Delgado to destroy this insurgency. And Rwanda sent thousands of troops. Again, little remarked. This is just last year, by the way, just to have you know. I'm not talking about ancient history. Little remarked in the Western media. There was an intervention by Rwanda into Cabo Delgado. They just burnt village after village was destroyed. For whom? Not for the government in Maputo, not for Mozambique's government alone, not even for the African Union based in Addis Ababa. No, this was done for ExxonMobil and French Total. This was done for the French. The French, look at what they did in Mali. Bombing from drones, wedding parties, just what we saw in Afghanistan and Iraq. They denied. This week I have an article coming out on French denials of atrocities in Mali. Talk to people on the ground there. Denied, killing entire families by drone attack. Same thing in Cabo Delgado. What's the attitude in the rest of the world? And I'm going to wrap up in 2 minutes, Petra, no worries. What's the attitude in the rest of the world? I went to Glasgow to the COP26. One of the mornings while I was there, I went for a PCR test. Standing in the queue in front of me were 5 or 6 oil executives. We're all wearing our suits and so on. And I had a press pass, talk about Shireen's murder today. I was wearing a big, giant press pass. And one of the oil executives turned to me, comes from an oil company from Texas, turned to me and very nice man said to me, what are you here for? And I said, well, I came to speak at a number of sessions because I've just returned from Mozambique and I'm talking about the oil companies off the coast of Cabo Delgado and so on. And he said, oh, interesting. And he engaged me and I told him the story of what I just told you about Al-Shabaab and the young people and the poverty in the area and so on. And he and the other oil executives were all listening, all extremely nice people, I must say. This man said something to me which really hurt me and I want to share it with you. He said to me, everything you say is correct. He said, everything you say is correct, but nobody cares. Said, everything you say is correct, but nobody cares. For the last 6-7 years, I've been in the process of building the institute, which I direct now, called Tricontinental. We are part of a project called the International People's Assembly, which is a platform of 200 political organizations, which includes the Landless Workers Movement in Brazil, the Democratic Way Party in Morocco, Workers' Party in Bangladesh, and so on. 200 different political and social organizations. We are committed to confronting the dilemmas of humanity because we think that actually that oil executive is wrong. We believe that people care. We believe that one of the problems in the world today, and I feel this is a compelling problem for you to consider, one of the problems is we don't know how to take those local conflicts and make them visible in a larger frame. I remember in the conflict in Syria, there were so many local stories of bravery, frustration, anger, and so on. But there was simply no framework to make those legible. They seemed anachronistic almost as if there was no room for them in public debate and discussion. Is there a way to listen to those people in the central belt of Mali or in Cabo Delgado? Is there a way to take their approach to the dilemmas of humanity and give those approaches power and voice? Is there a way to build counterpower to the hideousness of imperialism? I know that that's your project. It's an essential project, friends. But is there a way we're going to succeed? Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for your engaged presentation. And I'm very happy that in the end, you brought us the solidarities and what can actually be done. I mean, to have a kind of perspective or also a task to do after your analysis of the situation. Thanks a lot for that. Yes, I do see the questions in the chat. But I had a chat message before by Rabia Nasser, who wanted to respond to some of the points you made, and I would take him first because it was the first chat message I got, and then we'll go over to the messages, the questions which came, and I might try to get them together because they are already a number, and we have 20 minutes or a little bit longer, so I also keep the time. Try to be a little bit strict. Okay, Rabia, it's your turn. Rabia, you have to unmute. Oh, you can't. Can anybody unmute Rabia? Is that possible? Honey, is that possible? I know, but he wanted to respond in person. So I wonder whether this should not be possible.
Yeah, I think it works now. Thank you very much. And thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, it's your turn.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you very much, Vijay. It's been a long time since we meet to each other. And thank you for your talk. It's actually, I just want to say that using your tool, I just want to say some, I will not say counter argument. It's using the same tool to read the different story. If we are talking about the hegemonic power in the region, I think the fallacy that the US is bringing democracy to Iraq, or with supporting Israel, or with supporting the oppression in the region, is something that most of the people are not by it. So I don't think we have a lot of argument about the rule of the US in the region. However, using the same tools, we can see the Russian rule in Syria. We can see that the Russian, under the umbrella of sovereignty or self-interest, even without a slogan of democracy, they do the same from economic, political, and military point of view. They are destroying the ability of a country like Syria to survive. They plant the foundation for future conflict. They destroy any space for the ability with supporting a regime. And here is my argument toward what you are saying, that if you want to counter war on terror, or if you want to reject any kind of international implementation in your country, you don't destroy your country. You don't use these tools to smash the public space and to to kill, destroy, and then to flee the people from your country. And then you say there is no project. How you build a project if your space, your country is not allowed to you? Yes, the people will subordinate to Gulf, to Turkey, to other forces. And I want to insist on the idea that you mentioned, that it is a regional conflict. Yes, it is a regional conflict. But when the state, the major actor within the country, decided to smash the public space and we are talking about the journalists. Let's see the list of journalists who killed in Syria by the regime forces. What I want to say, that we are without an alternative. The solidarity within the Arab Spring is asking for alternative. The US is not providing this. Our political and economic system is not providing this. And for sure, Russia and China is not providing it, including even their economic abuse of resources whenever they invest. So I think we need to look besides the US, Russia, China, if we want to think about the future at least, to see how the solidarity of those people, even after the destruction of Syria, we still see that in Lebanon, Iraq, Algeria, and Sudan, the people still believe that they can make a change. They are not subordinated to the oppression, which I think it's a key to complete what you are saying about the, I will say, the hegemonic rule of the US. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rabir. I think if you would like to answer, I mean, it's one of the debates, I think, which is necessary, I think, also to get a different perspective. Do you want to respond to anything? We can also leave it as a statement by Rabir.
Well, firstly, it's great to see Rabia again. And, I actually don't think it's a debate. I think that this is a conversation that's,
Okay.
it's in search of, we're all in search of a new national project or regional project, depending on the scale of where you live. I think we're all in search of that. And, nobody wants to subordinate their countries to anybody else's project. I think that's part of where I think we would have more than agreement. The problem is the strategy to get there, to rebuild a kind of project. And it's certainly true that there are vicious powers that have been smashing public space for public action and public debate. And Syria has experienced that, of course. So I actually think this could be a hour, 2 hour, 3 hour, 5 hour conversation. But I very much welcome this conversation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Then I will go over to the questions. We have quite a lot, and I mean, maybe starting with the first question, and I think we should keep it as one question. It relates to the assassination of Shireen this morning, and one of the colleagues actually asked, how will, or better, how can international law protect journalists? And I will give it over to you, but we have, of course, these laws, yeah, maybe you have an answer, but I think it's not the question of law, it's more the question of implementation, I would say, but I will not, give it over to you.
Well, it's a really important question, because in a way, when we face tragedies like this, we seek a platform of justice. And there is a easy way. I'm using the word easy, but I don't mean it in a negative way. There is an easy way that we turn for justice above. We look for justice above, justice from a state, justice from an international institution, and so on. But let's be quite frank. Most systems of justice in the world that we have from above have been created to protect the powerful. Most systems of justice. Take a look at the international institutions, the International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice, and so on. Within half an hour of Russia's illegal intervention into Ukraine, a file opens in the International Criminal Court on war crimes by Russia and Ukraine. Okay, by all means, start a file, start writing in it. You know, when Fatih Bensouda, the special prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, opened a file on war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, when she opened the file, the United States government told her, they told her in the press, by the way, this is not a private comment, they said it publicly, that not only will we not give you a visa to come to the US to testify before the United Nations, which is her right as the special prosecutor of the criminal court, but we will never allow your family to get visas to come to the US. I mean, this is a mafia attitude. It's a mafia attitude. And the International Criminal Court closed the file. Then they opened it. Then they closed it. On Israel, for instance, it has taken many of us decades to establish the word apartheid. Just the word apartheid. Decades to establish the use of the word apartheid. Decades. I mean, I well remember when Rima Khalaf was the head of the UN agency in Beirut at ESCWA, and under her leadership, the word apartheid was used for the first time in a UN document. The Israeli government approached the UN Secretary General and asked for her to be fired. You know, I was sitting in her office in Beirut when that discussion was taking place. And it was horrifying to see how open they were. You know, they came before the press. Amira Haas wrote a piece about it in Haaretz. They came before the press and said, she needs to go. Why? Because she dared to have an enormous document on looking at the Arab situation. This is in 2013, use the word apartheid. In fact, it compared Israel to Saudi Arabia. That was, in fact, the problem that the Israelis had with the text. Saudi Arabians had no problem, by the way. They didn't complain. It was the Israelis that complained. Okay, we look above for justice, but these institutions are captured by the powerful. I mean, after all, the United States is not even a member of the criminal court, and yet it dictates the terms of the criminal court. It's not even a member, yet it dictates the terms of it. We need to fight to build our own forms of justice. That's what internationalism has to be. You know, robust political, social, international platforms that deliver their own forms of justice, you know, and that fight against the justice from above. Do I want Julian Assange extradited to the United States? By all means, no. Do you know why? Because Julian Assange and WikiLeaks revealed for us war crimes in Iraq, which we would never have been able to prove. They revealed war crimes in Afghanistan, which we would never be able to prove. The video collateral murder that demonstrates the killing of a Reuters journalist by US Apache helicopter pilots in 2007 was released by WikiLeaks. The pilots have never been brought before any kind of tribunal of justice, but Assange is in jail and has been for, you know, a decade. Justice from above is insufficient. We need to fight to build our own power. You know, we can't allow ourselves to beg them. The time of begging has to end.
Okay, thank you very much. This brings me, I mean, we have really a lot of questions now, so maybe, and it's difficult to take them together because they all have a different focus. So, but I think the next question really goes in what you just said. Somebody is asking what are the mechanisms that the international community could use to mitigate the violations committed by Israeli forces, and are there any available mechanisms? That's of course a very big question, and it's probably difficult to answer shortly, but still I would give it directly to you.
Well, the most important mechanism is to fight for the unity of the Palestinian people's political platforms. That was what the political prisoners wrote in their prisoner's letter now several years ago. I think that's one piece of it. The second piece is that I think people's movements, academics need to understand that we can't allow the fragmentation of Palestinians to become normalized. Those who have been exiled, those who live in camps in the countries around, those who are in the occupied Palestinian territory, those who are in 1948 Palestine and so on. That fragmentation, academics should never allow to become normalized. I think that's a very important academic exercise, is to fight against that normalization of, these are diaspora Palestinians. The term diaspora used for the Palestinians is part of the normalization. These are people living in exile. They are not diasporics. There's a big difference between somebody migrating for economic reasons, and this, an open political question. It's even different than people who are descendants of, say, the movement to enslave human beings. That's different, because there the political question of the right to return is not on the table. Here the right to return is on the table. It's a UN resolution. So to prevent normalization of the situation, I think that's an intellectual exercise. The actual political fight is being fought by the Palestinians. That's their fight. They are fighting it every day. I think that's their battle. They will require various kinds of allies, but they are fighting and leading their own battle. Academic world has to actually prevent the normalization of what is essentially an apartheid situation. And that's not easy to do. I mean, careers are at stake. People have a hard time making that position, particularly in the Atlantic world. I mean, in Europe, it's as difficult as it is in the United States. Some of these quote unquote pro-Palestinian positions have been made illegal. And those are all major political battles, I would argue.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would take now two questions. The first question, I mean, these are really, I think, very broad questions. And I mean, if you would have all the answers to it, we would probably praise you for quite some time. So the first question here is, why is there no embracing of the displaced people, which is what is required in the areas of conflict and war by neighboring countries and implemented by organizations responsible of supporting and aiding them? So the question is the embracing of displaced people, and that's probably a unique feature which we can observe nearly everywhere. And the second question goes a little bit in a different direction, but it also targets again why are people being exterminated in the name of war and terrorism, and why not fighting terrorism before it spreads instead? And especially since the majorities of victims are civilians, as you already stated beforehand. So these are the two questions I would take together.
Well, I'm going to put in something about the arms business in here to as an explanatory factor. But the first thing I want to say is that our friend Filippo Grandi, who used to be the head of the UN Palestine Agency and was, is a, good friend of many of the people on this call, Filippo Grandi now heads the UN Refugees Agency. And I know that he is a hard fighter for the rights of displaced people and so on. It's actually not the case that neighboring countries don't accept people from conflict zones. It's mainly neighboring countries that actually continue to host people who are displaced by war. Principally neighboring countries. I mean, still Lebanon, is a large Turkey and so on, and in Southern Asia, Afghan refugees had gone to Iran, to Afghanistan, to Pakistan, to India, and so on. So neighboring countries do are the main draws for displaced people. But I want to point out something else here, that, you know, the UN Refugees Agency is totally underfunded, and they have a hard time buying tents for people, let alone, you know, running schools and so on, which are essential. As part of the Sustainable Development Goals, the refugee agency has to run schools, has to have medical clinics. I mean, these are legal obligations. They can't just, you know, say, here's a piece of land, build your own huts out of corrugated iron. There are some requirements for schooling, for medical care, for this, that, and the other. But they just don't have the money. Look, last year, the world for the first time topped, global arms expenditure topped $2 trillion for the first time. In fact, that's an undercount, because the United States by itself spends about $1 trillion on weapons. If you add nuclear weapons to the list, over $2 trillion spent last year on weapons. 26 countries, meanwhile, in the world last year spent more money paying off their debt than on their own healthcare in their countries. 26 countries paid more to pay off wealthy bondholders, most of them in the Atlantic states, than on healthcare in their own countries. $2 trillion spent on arms, meanwhile. The problem in many of our parts of the world is not terrorism. It's the arms trade. It's the arms trade. You know, you go back and read, and I highly recommend going back and reading Anthony Sampson's book called The Arms Bazaar. Anthony Sampson's book, The Arms Bazaar, has a chapter on Lebanon, which I highly recommend, because it's a chapter that explains how the weapons got into that country. Small country, very small population. How did the various factions get so many weapons? Because it's the weapons that do the killing. It's not abstractions like terrorism, you know, it's the weapons. The amount of arms that get flooded into what's called the Middle East is obscene. You know, so when we talk about, you know, the question of people getting exterminated, the word that was used is exterminated. When we talk about extermination, look, you can't kill those numbers of people with bows and arrows. The moment you get even dangerous small arms, even pistols that can fire very high caliber and are automatic, you can kill a lot of people, and you don't have to actually face the fact of what you're doing. I was surprised to see the amount of small arms in Mozambique, which are light small arms, because the lighter the small arm, the easier it is to recruit children into your forces. They can carry small, light machine guns, for instance. Those light machine guns should be banned. Because if you want to ban child soldiers, which I know the UN has already done, it is hypocritical for the world to allow Western arms manufacturers to manufacture weapons which are designed to be carried by children. That's hypocritical. So I'm actually pretty fed up with our discussions of the way we talk about terrorism and all of this, because the real terrorists get off scot-free from our discussion, and that's the arms dealers. They are the real terrorists, and they are never talked about in the same breath as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and so on. Okay, we have problems with ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the whole lot of them. You know, send them all away to Mars with Elon Musk, as far as I'm concerned.
That's a good idea. Yeah, and that actually brings me to one question which connects to what you just said. I mean, I think the arms business is going to grow in the next year. I think we all can foresee that already. I mean, they are actually the winner of all the conflicts, and we all know that. But here one person asked what actually could be done. what would laws or what would be needed actually to prohibit the manufacture and development of weapons? I mean, is there any way out? I mean, that's in the end probably the most important question, because as you said, without arms, the world would look much better.
Well, look, I'm not going to be silly about this. It's going to be a big fight. But what I'm saying, for a platform such as KnowWar, and I like the double meaning of the way it sounds, KnowWar. For a platform like KnowWar, when one analyzes these conflicts, I think we often just don't put in the question of the arms trade because it's obvious. And it's not there then in our discussions. And we do it because we neglect it because it's obvious. But sometimes when something like that becomes obvious, it becomes normalized. And if you're not talking about it, it disappears from your analysis, in fact. And I'm saying that it should be front and center in our intellectual work, firstly. It is, of course, got to be lifted out at a broader public debate level. It's the old, when I first learned economics, we confronted this question of guns versus butter. It was there in our textbook. And I remember my teacher, when I was in school, was an old Indian Marxist who banged hard on the guns versus butter section, and it was ingrained in my head. And he kept saying, firstly, he said it's a bad phrase, guns and butter. Butter is not what we're talking about. We're talking about guns versus survival, not butter. I'll never forget that. I thought it was such an insightful thing to say, that the choice is between guns and survival. You spend more money on weaponry in a country, you are not spending money on survival, on dignity, on lifting people up by spending money in schools and so on. The Gulf Arab countries, I'm just giving these two examples. The Gulf Arab countries, Morocco, all got involved in the Abraham Accords, the so-called normalization with Israel. It's a ridiculous thing because Morocco, UAE, and Saudi Arabia had already basically normalized. But this was not a political normalization. This was a massive arms deal masquerading as normalization. Massive arms deal. These countries basically are subsidizing the US military industry. Basically, Saudi Arabia plays a huge role recycling the arms for the Western countries. And the other big so-called political deal of our time, AUKUS, the deal between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the US around China, the AUKUS deal, was also an arms deal masquerading as a political thing. It was a big deal in nuclear-powered submarines. Again, because we say, well, of course, this is important. We don't call it what it is. We start talking about the Abraham Accords as if it's about the normalization with Israel. Yes, of course it's that. But it's also an arms deal. And what will those arms be used against? They will be used against the people of Yemen, against the people of Western Sahara. That's who is going to pay the price. The Sahrawis and the Yemenis pay the price for the Abraham Accords, not to speak of the Palestinians.
Yeah. Thank you. And we have two last questions, and I would take them together because they both tackle Syria, and then also ask you maybe for a short question. We were already over time. But the first question actually is that after 10 years of the Syrian crisis, that's how it's written here, project and advocacy calls by associations and institutions to stop violence and war have increased, and there are still conflicts. And the question is why we are still discussing this issue today. And the last question, which is also regarding Syria, but also the question why there is this focus on Syria in light of the ongoing wars in Yemen and Iraq. So also the question, of course, of attention, which conflicts are focused on. And I would ask you to you know, maybe answer the two questions together. So, yeah.
Well, in fact, I'm not going to answer them because
Okay.
I'm going to say that there are people on this call like Rabia, like Omar Dahi, who are better positioned to answer the first question. And in fact, I know that in the panels to come, that will be a focus of attention. So I'll let them speak with much more expertise and care about the question of Syria today. On the question of why this or why that, why Syria, why not this or that? I mean, I was interested also in lifting up the Sahel conflict and Mozambique, and there's a million conflicts that we are dealing with, and isn't that the problem? Isn't that the problem? Isn't it the problem? And these are my final thoughts. If that's okay, Petra. I mean, isn't this the problem? This feeling that there are a million conflicts, and it's a moment of kind of existential. There's exhaustion that takes place. People feel exhausted by this. I started by saying these are very upsetting times, and you just want to turn inward. Although there are hundreds of millions of people who cannot afford to turn inward, maybe billions of people who cannot afford to turn inward, who are forced, who have conflicts imposed on them. They don't want these conflicts, they have it imposed on them. And so that's where we are. I mean, part of, I think, the intellectual task is to, as much as possible, take these million conflicts and produce narratives that give people confidence to intervene in the world, in groups, in collectivities of different kinds, to change things. I mean, intellectual activity, in my opinion, is only partly to understand what's happening. It's also to clarify and give confidence so that people can try to change things. We are not looking at the world just to understand it. We don't have that kind of luxury, the luxury of God. Aristotle's faraway point, where you watch something and you note it down but don't intervene. We don't have that luxury because we live in the world. We live in this world. And so part of, I think, the intellectual charge, is to provide clarity and confidence for people that they feel they could intervene in the world. I years ago read the German philosopher Ernst Bloch, and this is Ernst Bloch's book called The Principle of Hope. And what Bloch argued was that when we think, we should not have hope as an afterthought. You know how in a lot of books and articles, the last section is things to do, or the possibilities for the future. I'm saying it badly, but you get the point. What Bloch suggested is, can the entire epistemology, can the entire framework of analysis be grounded in the dialectic between disaster and hope? And I think we can, because, and here's the last point, I think we can, because there are some things in the world which Fanon called obstinate facts. There are some obstinate facts like hunger, like social despair, where people don't surrender to them. People don't say, okay, I'm hungry, I'm going to die. They fight to survive. That fight to survive is the real movement of history. That fight to survive actually is the clarifying moment of hope. It's the real movement of history. It's from that fight to survive that movements are built. That's why Marx and Engels write that the real movement of history is to socialism. Because either you acknowledge this obstinate fact and its fight to be transcended, or you say, well, let's just give up and let them bomb us to smithereens. Well, we are not going to give up and let them bomb us to smithereens. We are going to constantly try to transcend the obstinate facts. And so there is where hope lies. It lies in that desire for transcendence.
Thank you very much. I think that was a very great finishing of our keynote lecture, and I have to admit that I have to think a little bit longer about your dialectic, which you were bringing up in the end. But as you said, I mean, it's also an intellectual and also research task, of course, and not to stop there. So thank you very much for this presentation, and also thanks to everybody who put their questions in the chat. I think we really opened up already issues which we will probably discuss in the next 2 days. And it was a pleasure to have you. And I think we are all allowed to have a break and reflect a little bit on what you said, and maybe also exchange, like the colleagues who are sitting together in the seminar room, which is really missing in such conferences actually. But anyway, I think we made the best out of it. Thanks so much, and yeah, hope to see and hear you soon again.
See you later. Bye.
Yeah,
Thanks.
bye.
Thanks, Petra.
Yes, really, thank you. Thank you so much, Vijay. It was absolutely great to listen to you and this impressive way of dealing with our hope. And I think that is one of the main issues we will deal in the next hours and tomorrow as well, when discussing our research and our perspectives. So thank you so much, Petra. Thank you really so much for chairing the session. And yes, as you already said, 10 minutes break, and we will be back in 10 minutes. Thank you.